Most people don't repeat emotional mistakes because they lack intelligence or awareness. They repeat them because certain decisions feel familiar, and familiarity creates a quiet sense of safety, even when the outcome has already proven to be harmful. That's the part most people misunderstand. Knowledge does not automatically change behavior. If it did, regret wouldn't exist. Experience would be enough. Advice would work the first time, and patterns would end the moment we recognize them. But behavior doesn't change at the speed of information. It changes at the speed of emotional tolerance. And those two speeds are very different. When people look back at their decisions, they often assume the problem was a lack of awareness. In reality, awareness was usually present. But what was missing was the ability to stay with discomfort long enough to let a better option surface. That gap between knowing and tolerating is where emotional mistakes are born. Pressure rarely arrives as panic. Most of the time, it shows up quietly, as tension, as restlessness, as the feeling that something needs to be resolved, even when nothing is actually urgent. And in that moment, the brain makes a small but powerful shift. Instead of asking what choice makes the most sense in the long run, the question quietly becomes, what choice will make this feeling stop right now? That shift explains more repeated mistakes than most people realize. People agree to things they internally resist, not because they're weak, but because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. They stay in situations they've already outgrown, and not because they're unaware, but because leaving feels destabilizing. And they explain their decisions afterward, not to understand them, but to justify why they acted when they did. Relief becomes the goal. Not clarity, not truth. Relief. This is the first emotional mistake people repeat. Choosing relief over truth. Relief feels calming. It feels like control. It creates the illusion that the problem has been handled. The body relaxes. The mind quiets. For a brief moment, everything feels settled. That moment is convincing, because it feels like progress. But relief doesn't resolve the issue. It only quiets the signal long enough to move forward without resistance. And because the discomfort fades, the brain labels the decision as successful, even when the long-term consequences are negative. That's why emotionally driven decisions often feel right in the moment. They don't feel reckless or rushed. They feel settling. And that feeling convinces people they made the correct choice. Comfort, however, is not the same as correctness. The second emotional mistake people repeat is confusing intensity with importance. Strong emotions feel urgent. Urgency feels meaningful. And because of that, the brain assigns importance to whatever creates the strongest emotional reaction. Arguments feel more significant than quiet reflection. Pressure feels more real than patience. Fast decisions feel powerful, while slow decisions feel uncertain. So people chase intensity. They engage with what feels loud and immediate, and they ignore what feels subtle and stable. They mistake emotional volume for insight, yet even though intensity is often just noise amplified by discomfort. Some of the most important decisions people make don't feel dramatic at all. They feel boring. They feel unclear. They feel uncomfortable precisely because they don't provide emotional certainty. They don't announce themselves with confidence or excitement. They require waiting, reflection, and restraint. But uncertainty is difficult to tolerate. Silence feels like risk. Waiting feels like losing control. Not acting feels like failure. So people act, not because action is correct, but because action feels safer than stillness. Doing something feels better than sitting with not knowing, even when that something creates problems later. The third emotional mistake appears after the decision has already been made. Instead of examining the choice, the mind shifts into protection mode. The role changes from decision maker to defense attorney. The goal is no longer to understand what happened. The goal becomes protecting identity. That's why feedback feels like an attack. That's why reflection feels threatening. And that's why people defend choices they privately regret. The mind is not trying to be dishonest. It's trying to be comfortable. The brain doesn't want to admit error. It wants to preserve consistency. So it builds explanations, not to uncover truth, but to reduce discomfort. Those explanations become stories, and those stories allow the pattern to continue. This is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They tell themselves they were being practical, or flexible, or realistic. They say they did the best they could with the information they had. And then sometimes that's true. But often, the deeper reason is simpler. The decision ended the discomfort quickly. Once relief is achieved, the mind rarely goes back to re-examine the choice. It moves on, carrying the pattern forward. The fourth emotional mistake people repeat is relying on strategies that once worked, even when they no longer apply. The brain remembers what reduced pain before. It stores those responses as shortcuts, but it doesn't always update them. So people apply old solutions to new problems, old coping mechanisms to new environments, old behaviors to situations that require something different. For a while, this can look like consistency. It can feel like stability, but over time, it turns into repetition without progress. When those strategies fail, the response usually isn't adjustment. It's repetition. Louder, yet faster, more committed. The same approach, applied with more force, even as the results worsen. That's how patterns become traps. Most emotional mistakes aren't the result of low intelligence. They're the result of low tolerance. Low tolerance for discomfort, low tolerance for uncertainty, low tolerance for not knowing what happens next. Clarity doesn't come from speed. It comes from space. The people who break these patterns aren't the ones who feel less emotion. They're the ones who can stay present with emotion longer without immediately reacting to it. They pause, not to judge themselves or suppress what they feel, but to notice the pull toward familiar behavior. That pause is where different decisions begin. In that pause, something important happens. The mind has a chance to ask a better question. Not, how do I make this feeling stop? But wait, what is this feeling asking me to notice? That shift doesn't eliminate discomfort. It reframes it. Discomfort stops being an emergency and starts being information. And information, unlike urgency, can be used. The next time you feel yourself moving toward a choice that feels strangely familiar, stop for a moment. Notice the urge to resolve the feeling quickly. Notice the pull toward relief. Then ask yourself what you're actually trying to escape. The situation itself, or the feeling the situation creates. Once you can separate the two, you gain leverage. And leverage is what changes behavior. Different decisions don't come from more confidence or more certainty. They come from a greater capacity to tolerate uncertainty without rushing to end it. Over time, that capacity grows, and as it does, the same situations that once triggered automatic responses start to feel manageable. That's when patterns begin to loosen. If this helped you recognize emotional patterns you've been repeating without realizing it, subscribe to the channel. Here, we break down emotions and decisions so you can understand your behavior instead of fighting it.